Good morning. This is the Dr. Obutashaka show. Greetings to all of you. Um, I hope you all enjoyed your holidays, those of you that celebrate Christmas, Kwanzaa, and New Year's. The last two shows were fill-ins that were broadcast of interviews that I had done in that month in December. So one was a recorded presentation on the art of leadership, and it drew insights from my 2-volume work, The Art of Leadership, that took me 10 years to write. You can purchase this through Gumroad. These books are not on great African or African American leaders. These books are on African leadership and organizing philosophies, strategies, tactics, and methods. They come from my experience of organizing and the experience of a whole lot of African people. And then it went through 3 drafts. I looked at organizing and leadership as it operates in the world and effective methods, and whatever that worked, some of which I've used and others that I know work, I've incorporated into these 2 books. Volume 1 is available. Volume 2 is right now out of print and will be put out again shortly. The second pre-recorded show was entitled Twin Lineal Families, Communities, and Nations. And this is the central theme of my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, which, interestingly enough, the Hoover Institute, when they tried to wipe out Black studies, and we defeated them after a 2-year battle. That's the biggest think tank in the US, the one that shaped Reagan's agenda. A couple of years later, they revealed that they had spied on 32 of my classes while they were trying to wipe us out. We were under a heavy corporate attack, CSU, California State University system attack. And after admitting that they couldn't write their book on our demise because we had defeated them, they then referred to my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, as my magnum opus. That means big stuff, master work. And I think they figured out, they were coming after what they considered some Black activist who doesn't think. That's why they went after us, to wipe out our college. And in the end, they found out they were dealing with a department that produces great thought and great action on the ground. So Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality is my most important work. And Twin Lineal Families, Communities, and Nations, the term twin lineal summarizes the model that I discovered that's the model of African families globally. And it's really the basis for creating just societies, which radical thinkers like Marx really missed. If you don't deal with the family as the foundation for transforming society, you're going to be locked into the old methods. And for the West, it's been patriarchy. And then the old histories and old philosophies, which come not only from not resting your transformative model for society on the family, but comes from not questioning the philosophy and the worldview of the society that you're critiquing. And if you're using the same worldview, even though it's an attempt to create a radical transformation, you're going to find yourself full of contradictions. So this second presentation is a brief summary of that. And I stress brief, it's about 45 minutes. Some of you think I can't do that. So check that out, and it's contained in my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. For those of you that haven't signed up for the webinar for the 6-fold stages to mental freedom, do so, you can do so by emailing me at otashaka@sbcglobal.net. And you can let me know that you're interested in the webinar, and I'll sign you on. Also want to encourage people to subscribe to the Dr. Obutashaka Show, and encourage other people to do so as well, and help me and do some recruitment to get more people registered on this show platform. So Thursday, January 6, 2021, actually January 6, 2021, was the year in which the nation's capital was attacked through what has been described as an insurrection, where over 100,000 people rallied to hear Trump and then marched on the Capitol. And so we're going to see a brief clip of that attack on the Capitol, and we'll get into the topic for this show, which is the January 6th insurrection, an expression of the Second Post Reconstruction. You can see here clip.
Capital and fight.
You'll never take back our country with weakness. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Around 1 p.m., as Trump is wrapping up his remarks in the park, the day turned violent. A group of his supporters on the western side of the Capitol confront the handful of police guarding the barriers and force their way through.
Moments after Mr. Trump finished his more than hour-long speech, thousands of protesters streamed from that rally site and walked.
Outsized number of people charged in the Capitol riots, and heard from others in that community who are still trying to understand the forces that propelled their neighbors to the siege.
Any other patriots on the fence about joining us in D.C.? Don't think, just do.
They have reached up onto the terrace of the Capitol.
As TV screens showed the destruction and chaos at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, real estate agent Papa Johnson watched it all unfold on social media from her house in Frisco, Texas, as one Facebook friend after another posted from the Capitol.
Then when I started not only just recognizing names, but faces.
So you can see from the film clip a reminder of the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. It's been described as an insurrection, where over 100,000 people rallied to hear Trump speak. And if you note, say that we need to take this country back, and also refer to the fact that the purpose of this rally was to stop the steal. And this is, of course, what the media has focused on, that the purpose of Trump's rally was to try and roll back his loss in the 2020 presidential election, based on the myth that the election had been stolen, when in fact Trump lost because of his incompetency as a president in handling COVID-19 and failing to pass any legislation that really benefited his base, though he kept his base largely with him, except for a few defections in the suburbs. And he brought out over 10.1 million more voters than he had in the previous election. But he lost, not because the election was stolen, but because with Blacks leading the charge and Black Lives Matter playing a key role in it, and other organizational forces as well as other coalitions made up of brown people, yellow, young whites, and a third of whites who vote, those that vote Democrat. The majority vote Republican. That coalition led by blacks out-strategized, out-organized, and outvoted Trump. And so Stop the Steal is the myth, and this is the myth that the media has focused on to stress that the election wasn't stolen. And for the majority of the Republican Party, they don't buy it. And probably a majority of whites in this country, many of whom don't vote, probably don't buy the analysis that it was a fair election, but it was. So the media has focused on the Stop the Steal. But what I'm going to do is focus on the historical context of this insurrection. What's really behind it? Because the US of A, meaning the United States of Amnesia, the United States generally ignores history, and most of your reporters know very little about it, and especially about African and African American history, or the history of any people of color, but generally they don't know the history of their own country, most of them. So the mass media has done the simplistic emphasis on Stop the Steal, but there's more to what's going on with this. And in the context of the January 6th insurrection, we've had the House of Representatives investigation into the insurrection. A number of demonstrators, not very many compared to the over 100,000 who rallied for Trump and thousands who stormed the Capitol. Prosecutions have centered on a few of the demonstrators, with almost all of them receiving very short sentences, treating this as not serious. When this is the second occupation of the Capitol on a violent basis since the War of 1812. And I should point out that in the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson's biggest victory came in Louisiana when he had the support of Black troops who helped defeat this British invasion. And they were rewarded by being stripped of their weapons and sent to do field work after that, typical of Andrew Jackson, who was a Trump favorite. And by the way, Trump and Andrew Jackson share a common historical legacy of both being populists, which means popular racists. Andrew Jackson was an Indian killer, Native American killer, killed a lot of Native American women, children, elders, slaughtered a lot of them, though he couldn't get away with that in the war against the Seminoles, where the Africans and the Seminole Native Americans fought together and won military victories, the only military war. The Native Americans had won battles before, but this was the only war that Native Americans won against the European, and the only successful slave rebellion that Africans carried out in the Florida Everglades. This isn't normally noted. So Trump is, in many ways, and this was his favorite president, hung in the White House, and I say hung. This was Trump's favorite president, and he's as populist, though his populism is fake, as Andrew Jackson was. He was really your first populist president, because the whites in this country love seeing Native Americans slaughtered. So what we're seeing so far is that they're treating January the 6th as tiddlywinks, as not serious. If we're going to look at the move to prosecute them, a large sector of Republicans in the House of Representatives have endorsed this or refused to criticize it. And Attorney General Garland, who had been Obama's choice for Supreme Court before Mitch McConnell blocked it, he has stated, in fact, on January the 6th, this Thursday, that he was going to prosecute whoever was responsible. But so far, only underlings have been prosecuted. None of the big shots, not the president, not the people who financed it, not those who strategized it. The big fish haven't been touched. So we'll see what happens on that front. So what I'm going to do today with this insurrection is put it in its historical context. And this historical context is a historical context of post-Reconstruction. And the January 6th insurrection is an expression of whites' reaction to this historical period that we call the Second Post Reconstruction. You won't really understand the meaning of this insurrection unless it's put in this context. So the title for today, the January 6th insurrection, an expression of the Second Post Reconstruction. Brother Malcolm X, a student of history, often observed that of all studies, history is best designed to reward our research. Now, as a historian, I'm a historian, philosopher, and political strategist, scientist, or whatever, of a revolutionary focus. My observation of history is this: history doesn't follow a straight line, because history is a combination of the history of people. And the pattern of the lives of people is a pattern of up and down. The old spiritual says, sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord. That is history. I was having my hair cut about a week ago, and my barber was explaining how he survived this COVID-19 by getting his government loans and stuff and holding on. And he said, I know to always keep reserves, financial reserves, because life is up and down. And when you're up, you got to be prepared for the downs, you know? And African people understand this. And by the way, to understand history, you need to connect philosophy to history, because philosophy prepares you for the pattern. And for those of you that have the real trouble with astrology, when my sister and I did this series on astrology, and by the way, some of you have gone to her for readings, and one person is getting lessons on 12 classes on astrology. So she called me to say that she was happy about that. One of the things I did was on precessional cycles, which is the 26,000 Earth wobble in relationship to the ecliptic. And I was showing how through different periods of the precessional cycles, which were about 2,100 years, for a total of approximately 26,000 years, there are certain themes that history tends to go through, and you find the whole world going through these cycles. But these cycles are themselves the result of light planetary motion, in that stellar motion, in that planets and stars don't usually rotate on a circle, they rotate on a spiral. And history follows that pattern just as your life does. It zigs and it zags. And so while there's a story that history repeats itself, it really doesn't. But sometimes it appears to. So I'm going to be looking at these two periods, the post-Reconstruction period of 1876 and the post-Reconstruction period of 1968, which you're in right now. And you're going to see similarities. But because history follows a spiral pattern, there will also be differences. And this is extremely important to point out. So if we're going to understand the cyclical historical period called post-Reconstruction in the context of the January 6th insurrection, then I think it would help you to go back and look at some of my previous shows, because as I pointed out, like Louis Armstrong, we're both born August the 4th, and he said his musical compositions were like chapters in a book, and he always had a typewriter with him, and in between performances, he was always typing. He was a writer. But his musical compositions were like chapters in a book, with an introduction, a middle, and a conclusion. And each of my shows are like chapters in a book, and you'll see that I have themes. So I have a part 1, a part 2, a part 3. And so if you're going to really understand this, in addition to doing your own historical study, I would suggest that you look at my October 17th, 2020, October 17th, 2020 show entitled How Black Power Produced the Military Defeat of the Confederacy, Segregation, and Trump. Now, that was a renamed title because I had another title that was, when this show was put out on October the 17th, 2020, less than a month before the presidential election, it was geared to the election. So it went something like Lessons from Post-Reconstruction to Vote Trump Out of the White House into the Jailhouse. I changed that title later because I didn't want to center this on Trump. But at the time, it was appropriate. So check out the October 17, 2020 show entitled How Black Power Produced the Military Defeat of the Confederacy, Segregation, and Trump. This show has beautiful cinematography. And by the way, you know, that comes out of my pocket. You know, I'm paying a cinematographer to do some really beautiful film work. And my cinematographer is a brother named Lo Rojan, who's also a black belt in karate, a beautiful brother. And so he's got a lot of beautiful historical pictures there of blacks in the Civil War and a whole lot of other pictures. And I should point out, these shows are good for young people. You could have someone who's 11 or 12 and watch them, and they would understand them as well. So the reason you need to go back, if you've seen it, go back and watch it again. But for those of you that haven't watched this show, which is again entitled How Black Power Produced the Military Defeat of the Confederacy, Segregation, and Trump, which is suggesting that the 170,000 black soldiers that fought in the Civil War, they were the balance of power. They won the war. Before that, the North had hardly no victories. In fact, Lincoln had to announce his Emancipation Proclamation only when he had scored a victory, because he had been losing. And the only reason why he issued the Emancipation Proclamation was to give blacks an incentive to fight, because the Confederacy was kicking their behinds. And it's when old double old soul brother and some sisters disguised as brothers, and old Harriet Tubman, who was using her own spycraft skills, got their trusty rifles and started aiming them at their former masters, that they not only made them holy, but they led to the defeat of the Confederacy. And in that show, I note white Southerners saying so. It's only when the Negroes got involved did we start losing. Yeah, you're darn right. Because the baddest warriors on the planet are these soul brothers and sisters. And I want to stress, sisters is bad too. You know what I mean? If you go to Africa, you'll see these warrior sisters as something else. You know what I mean? The Chinese have that similar kind of thing where some of their best martial artists are women because they're faster than the men. Now, the men got their strength, but you want to go up against some of these sisters, you know what I mean? And Soul Sister is something else. But the brothers, they were the balance of power. And without us, a different system would be prevalent in this country, which they're trying to restore right now. So I would suggest that you check that out. And it's going to provide a background for what's being discussed today, a more in-depth background. The second show you should watch to help you better understand what I'm going to be discussing today, and which I consider to be part 2 of this show I'm referring to now, examine the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol 3 days after it happened. And in this analysis, I examined the right-wing forces involved in that attack, what their motives were, and so on. This show is entitled, quote, Trump, White Militias, and the Right-Wing Sedition at the Nation's Capital. And this show was produced on January the 9th, 2021, 3 days after the attack on the Capitol. So I recommend that you watch these shows if you haven't already, because my shows are like chapters in a book, and these shows provide historical and political background for understanding this show. And these shows are like series, just as my shows on Kemetic spirituality, dealing with the powers of God that reside within us, one of which drew 61,000 views. These shows are also like the series on the Anu, in which we went into formative Kemetic history, which hardly no historians cover. They deal with dynastic African history. And then I had a series on astrology and a series on trauma and addiction and some others as well. So look at these shows that cover particularly Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction to get other analysis. I should also point out that W.B. Du Bois's work, Black Reconstruction, is the classic work for this particular subject. And it was the only one on Reconstruction that told the truth. The other stories on Reconstruction, both Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, were basically about the big lie, which is what America's good at. And that's partially why people in this country can fall for stop steal, you know, partially because it means more than that. We'll get into it in a minute, but partially because history is always being made up in this country. And so you should read Black Reconstruction by W.B. Du Bois, his best work. So if we're going to understand the meaning of January 6, 2021, the meaning of the attack on the nation's capital, a violent attack, then the question is, what's its connection to the Second Post Reconstruction? To understand the historical cycle defined as the Second Post Reconstruction, we've got to define what the First Post Reconstruction was and what it meant historically. Generally speaking, the First Post Reconstruction is generally defined as the historical period of 1876 that arises from a close presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and remember, the Republicans then were the ones who, you know, supported ending slavery only when they were on the verge of losing the Civil War. They didn't fight the war to end slavery, but once the only way they could win it was to do emancipation, they did it in paper. Blacks were not really freed by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation because it took effect in the states where blacks were enslaved. And slave masters were not going to free blacks just because Northern president had issued an Emancipation Proclamation. This was more designed to encourage blacks to flee the plantations and to prevent Great Britain from recognizing the South, which it was on the verge of doing. And only thanks to people like Frederick Douglass and others who had traveled in Europe as anti-slavery abolitionists, politicizing whites in Britain, did the white racist working class stand up and side with blacks and tell their ruling class, you better not recognize the Confederacy. But it took the Emancipation Proclamation for that incentive to be provided for different parts of the world to rally behind this cause. But more important, it took the Emancipation Proclamation for blacks to have the incentive to fight, because we're not about to fight for a union that's going to maintain slavery. And so in previous shows, I've gone into some of this. So if we're going to understand this period today, arising out of the January 6, 2021 insurrection, and generally this period that began in 1968, that is, as the Second Post Reconstruction, we need to understand the First Post Reconstruction, and historians have generally put that date as 1876, when a presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and Samuel J. Tilden, Tilden, a Democrat. Remember, the Democrats were the party of slavery at this point, contested for the presidency. Hayes, representing supposedly the Union forces that had won the Civil War, and Tilden, representing the defeated Confederacy, which, by the way, had in the previous midterm elections just taken over the House and the Senate. Up to that point, the Republicans had ruled the presidency, the House, and the Senate. So that also means that there are other problems that's going to be faced in the ending of the presidency of the Republican General Grant, who was then president of the United States. He's going to have problems pursuing Reconstruction policies during his last 2 years. Reconstruction was the period where blacks were granted the vote for a variety of reasons that I'll go into in a minute. So in this close presidential election, it's so close, it's thrown into the House of Representatives to choose the president. And by the way, when Trump was running for president in his second term, they were pulling a lot of their strategies out of the First Post Reconstruction in terms of the way to steal the election. And I'm not saying because Trump knew anything about it. I'm not even saying that the Republicans actually went and studied post-Reconstruction. I'm simply saying that they were carrying on something that has been visceral in the American blood system. You know what I mean? Cheat and steal. Get any way you can. And then when you win, call it a victory. So when this is thrown into the House of Representatives and they're going to pick the next president, the Democrats, who now have control of the House and the Senate, but not the presidency, agree to let the Republican become president, but it's on conditions. And the main condition is that the South be empowered to handle blacks. And that meant that federal troops would be withdrawn. That meant that the South could do what they wanted to blacks. And for a variety of reasons, we'll see the North went along with this. Now, the main gains made by blacks after the Civil War comes under what's called the First Reconstruction. And the main gain was the right to vote. Blacks wanted 40 acres and a mule. And a lot of blacks were in anticipation of this. And so when Reconstruction first starts, it starts because the South now wants to wage an economic and political war, even though they've lost the military war. And how do they do it? They want to regulate the national banks, meaning the banks that come from the North, and they want to put a tariff on goods coming from the North, meaning a tax, while goods coming from Europe come in free of a tariff or a tax. And this is like a way to try and put Northern business out of business, or at least weaken them. And so it's when the South indicates that they're still carrying out a war by other means that the North reluctantly decides to give blacks the vote to protect their interests, aligned with a minority of whites who come into the South that they call scallywags, which is a false term designed to indicate that they were out for ruin and theft and everything else. This was the history of Reconstruction that was painted by virtually all historians in this country other than W.B. Du Bois until recently. So what happens with Reconstruction is blacks get the vote for whites, particularly Northern industrial whites, to protect their economic interests. But for blacks who want what's much more, this is a boon because it gives them at least some power to wield. And so blacks begin to occupy government offices, sheriffs, offices at the local and state level and in Congress, and a few senators who had fought in the Civil War. So this was the gain of Reconstruction, the biggest of which was the black vote. And with the black vote, blacks pushed for free public education, the only time in the South that the South experienced free public education. So post-Reconstruction, the first one, and the one we're going through now, is the period where the gains made during Reconstruction are rolled back. And this is the cycle of repression. So it's important to stress that while these gains are rolled back, they're not completely rolled back, because the historical cycle changes that period. Because if they were completely rolled back, they could go straight back to slavery. As it is, Frederick Douglass made this observation. He said, with post-Reconstruction, blacks became slaves of all whites. And that's true in that any white person could do whatever they wanted to a black person unless a black person defended themselves and faced no legal consequences. And that's largely been true down to this day, except for a few exceptions. But the truer description of what happened to blacks in the post-Reconstruction period especially is blacks moved from being slaves of individual slave masters to being slaves of the states. That's the key thing to get straight. The state becomes the new slave master. That's the real key point to get. And so in the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, the biggest part of the compromise is that blacks' fate is being left solely to the states. And that's the issue that's going on right now that we'll get into later, because then it means the popular will of good old white people. Don't you feel good entrusting your future to people that hate the hell out of you? You feel good about that? Hell no. You know what I mean? So this was the nature of the period called Reconstruction, and then the period of post-Reconstruction. Post-Reconstruction is the rollback period where they go against the gains you made during the Reconstruction period. So Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in 1876. Historians generally treat this as the period where troops were withdrawn from the South. I recommend you watch my previous shows where I go into this more detail than I'm going to do now. But the truth is, by the time of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, you only had federal troops in three southern states, only 3. And there were very few of them even then. So while we'll make this distinction between Reconstruction, where you have gains, and post-Reconstruction, where it's taken back, the truth is history is always more complex. And so within a cycle where there's reform, there's repression. That's how it works. But it's just that the reform is greater than the repression. And so in this cycle, where Blacks had made some gains, at the same time, in 1866, Bedford Forrest, a Confederate general, forms the Ku Klux Klan. And so it's from 1866 on that Blacks are facing violence at the hands of whites, not just 1876. And while there are troops in the South, federal troops, they're never enough to check this, because the North never really made these concessions because they cared that much about Blacks. You had a few that did. You had the radical abolitionists. They cared. But the overwhelming majority, they were governed by self-interest. So what you find then is Blacks were put in a position during this period in which the Klan is raising hell and gunfire and violence on Blacks. Blacks had to defend themselves as best they could. And of course, you had post-Civil War Black men who had fought, some of whom still had their arms. There was an effort to get us to give them up or to send us west to kill Native Americans, those few who remained in the army under the Buffalo Soldiers. Blacks wanted, those that were in the army, they wanted to stay in the South and defend their own people. And absent that, and some were still in the Union Army, absent that, Blacks were put in a position where they had their own militias and fought, but greatly outnumbered by the whites, but they fought. And it should be pointed out that this Reconstruction period kills this notion that, slavery worked this dehumanization on us, and that some historians, including some Blacks, talked about Black servility, how servile Blacks were. Well, if you check out the behavior of Blacks during Reconstruction, Blacks in Reconstruction are taking no mess. Blacks during Reconstruction are not stepping to the side of the street when some white person comes. Blacks during Reconstruction, especially in the early period, are hoping for and doing everything they can to put pressure to gain 40 acres and a mule. But meantime, they're fighting for the best contracts they can get on a plantation and will leave one to bargain for another. And they're out of control. And this is one of the problems that the Confederacy has. Now, after being defeated, Blacks won't stay in a box. You hear me? And Black men and Black women, they had concerns for what? They wanted land. They wanted better wages. They wanted education for their children. And they were going to defend and did defend their wives and children against white violence. And so this was a restive period. And remember, Blacks had just come off of defeating the Confederacy in the Civil War. They weren't taking mess. And they had very little to fight with, but they had the spirit. So this is contrary to your picture of woe is me, what was done to us in slavery, which was terrible. We're tough people. We came out tough. And I'm telling you, these older blacks, the closer to slavery you are, the closer to Africa you are, the badder they are. You hear me? There's some tough people. And this is the period where the greatest amount of inventions are made in this country and among black people, by black people. This is a period of black business development, black institutional development, when blacks hardly have 2 pennies to tie together. And they're looking out for each other because they're drawing from this mighty culture that they had created during enslavement. So this is Reconstruction's a fighting period and post-Reconstruction. Now, to complicate matters more, while 1876 is defined as the rollback date for black rights, the rollback actually starts a lot earlier, and it's got to do with other complicating factors. There's, the Klan writing and all of this, which is designed to try and intimidate us, but blacks won't be intimidated. And we have, prior to 1876, when Lincoln dies, his vice president takes over, Andrew Johnson. And Johnson refuses to really support Reconstruction. Part of the reason Lincoln picked him was that he was a moderate Republican. He had opposed the Civil War, and as a result, was viewed as someone that would be a good person to be Lincoln's vice president. And he had been hard on people in his state, West Virginia, who had sided with the Confederacy. But when he becomes president, he's on the side of the plantocracy, the former slave masters, and very much against blacks. And he's a Republican. So the Congress has to actually overrule him, impeach him. He survives by only 1 vote. And so he weakens Reconstruction, even though, the Congress restores it. The Congress itself, under Republicans, because they control both houses and the presidency, wasn't that committed to Reconstruction either, except for the right to vote for blacks. They were unwilling, except for radical Republicans, to grant 40 acres and a mule. And blacks deserve much more. And by the way, it's important that that demand was put forward. It would have been important for blacks to get 40 acres and a mule. But guess what? If blacks got 40 acres and a mule, to run 40 acres, you need loans. You need capital. And where were blacks going to get loans? To this day, it's hard. You heard my former student who was giving you the thing on his tea shop and coffee shop in the Hunters Point. He's financed it out of his own pocket. That's why something like 95% of black businesses are owned by one person, because they can't get financing to hire anybody else. So this was also the bind that blacks were in. The main concern of the Confederacy that had been defeated was controlling black labor. That was the main concern. And I should point out now, the difference is now in this second post-Reconstruction, black labor isn't as important. You better look at that one. With the deindustrialization of America, and now America shifting to a service economy, black labor isn't as important. Unless that labor is retooled, and a part of it has been, because we have a sizable section of blacks who've gone to college. We have blacks who have skills as electricians, plumbers, various things. And that's what we need to up, is our skill level. And this younger generation needs training at the hands of the older generation before this older generation's gone out. But the key point is, at this period of Reconstruction, the forces of post-Reconstruction those take back forces are also operating before it becomes full blown. A compromised Reconstruction, a failure to grant land rights to blacks, and a failure to really protect black voters. So in 1875, when the Republicans lose control of both houses of Congress, there's a move to safeguard the powers of the president for his last 2 years, prior to really the last year prior to the next presidential election. And so a politician named Benjamin Butler and others proposed a civil rights bill and an enforcement act. Now, this is kind of late. This should have been done much earlier. And what this enforcement act did was give the president, who's a Republican, now facing a House and a Senate of Democrats, former Confederates largely, the Enforcement Act expanded the president's power to put down conspiracies aimed at intimidating voters. This means mainly giving the president the power to protect black voters. You know, that's what they were supposed to be doing during the whole Reconstruction. And so in January 4th, 1875, Democrats attempted to seize control of the State Assembly of Louisiana and install violently 5 Democrats into disputed seats. Now, they've just been defeated in the Civil War. They're acting like they won it, you know? So Grant, as one historian described it, with a new sense of determination, I'm paraphrasing him, new, I mean, why is it new? He should have been doing this all along. He decides to protect what he called colored voters' rights. And he ordered General Sheridan, one of the Union Civil War generals, to eject these whites who had occupied the State House violently, kind of like the attack on January the 6th, except this is on a State House. So you would think that, okay, he's just protecting Reconstruction, something that the Union hadn't done that much to do, but they had done a little. He's doing more. And Grant had also seen the bravery and the skill of black fighters in the Civil War, because he wouldn't have been president, but for us, 170,000 kicking the Confederacies behind, you know? So he had some respect for blacks. And so what's the reaction of the Republicans to this? And this is really showing you that inside this period of Reconstruction, you're seeing the head of post-Reconstruction raising itself. That is, in this period where concessions have been made to blacks, you're seeing at the same time the party that made the concessions willing to go back on them because they weren't really that committed to them in the first place. So what happens right after Sheridan makes his move against these whites, these violent whites, a meeting is called at Funnell Hall in Boston, and Grant's actions, and these are Republicans who were meeting, instead of being praised, they're criticized. And they're criticizing Grant for ordering Sheridan to go against these whites who had seized Louisiana government, the Republicans say these whites were heroes. They were like the founding fathers. And so they were very critical. And so when a leading abolitionist named Wendell Phillips criticizes them for opposing Grant in exercising his powers, as he said, to protect millions, he's hissed down. He's hissed down. And so what you're seeing during the period of Reconstruction, the Republicans that are supposed to be supporting Reconstruction are doing it half-heartedly. And they have some sympathy for the South. And it's kind of like what we've seen with Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot 3 men, killed 2 of them during demonstrations in Kenosha that he had no business being at, with a military weapon that provoked an effort by people to protect themselves and leads him to murder 2 people. He gets off scot-free and is now regarded as a hero by a lot of whites, particularly on the right. And at least one congressman has offered him a job. You know what I mean? And so during this period of reform, you see repression, and we see the same thing now in the Second Post Reconstruction, where militias, right-wing militias, are often viewed as patriots, when in fact they're cold-blooded killers, or at least advocates of that. So before the Hayes-Tilden Compromise brought an end to Black Reconstruction, most Republicans had lost their stomach for supporting Black Reconstruction. Like some Democrats now have no stomach for supporting Black and brown voting rights today. The Democratic Party has a 1-vote majority in the Senate. The House has already put together voting rights legislation, and yet it can't go through the Senate. Of course, there's a solid wall of Republicans opposing it, and there's only a 1-vote majority, which will be the Vice President Kamala Harris, but they have the votes. If they do it through reconciliation, if they put down the filibuster, something that the president doesn't want to do. And so you see, again, this half-hearted commitment to pursuing Black rights. And in this particular case, the majority of the Senate is there because of a Black victory in Georgia that put 2 Blacks, 1 Black and 1 Jewish American into the Senate as Democrats, giving the Democratic Party a 1-vote majority to do their will under reconciliation that doesn't need 60 votes. So you're seeing the same half-heartedness that you saw during the end of Reconstruction, not even at the heart of post-Reconstruction. And now we're in the midst of post-Reconstruction, as we'll see. So the point is that the seeds for post-Reconstruction were to be found in Reconstruction. Blacks were granted the right to protect Northern interests, but once the threat of the South to wage a war against Northern interests economically subsided, and the South was willing to accept Northern dominance, particularly economic dominance, then the South was willing to accept that in exchange for being given a free hand to deal with Blacks the way they wanted to. And as one white Southerner said, we'll strip that 14th Amendment of everything, you know? So the Second Post Reconstruction, so to understand this period we're in now that gives rise to, among other things, the January 6th insurrection at the nation's capital, it's very important to understand this background. The Second Post Reconstruction begins in 1968 with the election of Tricky Dick, also known as Richard Milhouse Nixon, whose appraisal of Black people was something like this. After meeting with the NAACP, he said to one of his assistants, he said, "You know, those people have contributed nothing to human civilization." He's what you call a smart racist because he actually read some history books, all the history books that wrote us out of history, and believed them. You know what I mean? So that was Tricky Dick. But this is what Tricky Dick says when he becomes president. And I read this in Muhammad Speaks, an old friend of mine, Bert Foster, who had been a boxer. He was in his 70s. He was a house painter. He gave me a box full of Muhammad Speaks, and I filed them. And in one of them, this is what Nixon said. He said, "The Blacks didn't vote for me, and I owe them nothing." Nixon wasn't exactly a kind man or a humane man. He nursed grievances. That's one reason why he had Watergate on his behind. You know, he was suspicious of everybody, you know, and was vindictive and out to get everybody. So what we see with the policies of Nixon are the beginning of this second post Reconstruction, a move to take back the gains that had been made by Blacks in the second Reconstruction that begins in 1955. So just as you had the Rutherford B. Hayes election to the presidency, not just on the conditions of removing federal troops, but another condition was that he agreed to appoint 2 Southerners to the Supreme Court, which he did. And they were to be there to dismantle the Civil Rights Bill that had been passed during the waning period of Grant's administration. So the Supreme Court was a central weapon in dismantling Black rights, in this case, the right to vote, and general civil rights in general, but by allowing the South to erect apartheid measures. So what we find is with Nixon does the same thing. Nixon proceeds to appoint 4 people to the Supreme Court, the first of whom replaces Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was the initiator of Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the decision that ushers in the beginning on the educational level of Reconstruction. It's the Montgomery bus boycott that ushers it in on the political level. Student sit-ins, and particularly the successful movements, King's campaign in Birmingham and the Selma to Montgomery march that ushers in legislation against segregation and for voting rights. And these are serious defeats of the South and the white supremacy forces. I don't use that term anymore, but they still had some power, and these were their first real defeats since the loss of the Civil War. And so the Supreme Court was solidifying it, and so with Nixon, he's doing the same thing. He creates, through his 4 Supreme Court justices, 4 conservatives who begin to reverse the gains of the 60s. And a key decision that comes out of the Supreme Court under Nixon is the Bakke decision that attacked affirmative action, another gain of the movements of the 60s. In California, the San Francisco Freedom Movement, which was California-wide, the only successful one in the North, one of the things it gave birth to was the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And then underneath that, a lot of measures that promoted affirmative action throughout the state, the largest state in the United States. So these were rulings against these gains. When Reagan comes into office, he further rolls back these gains. And then Bill Clinton carries out the greatest rollback by ending welfare without blacks really standing up and fighting, let alone the Democratic Party. When welfare is less than 1% of the federal budget. In fact, the year in which Clinton ends welfare, except for 5 years, no longer lifetime award for poor people, that same year, he increases his defense budget. And the defense budget is where most of the money that your tax dollars goes into the federal government goes. And so you have potholes all over the country. You have no money funding schools. You have no health care that really amounts to anything. Obamacare is something, but nowhere near what you have in Europe. And Europe is following the Roosevelt model, the New Deal model. And what you're seeing is, in this post-Reconstruction period, the retrenchment on the few gains that blacks ended up benefiting from. And if the Republicans gain the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they'll end Social Security. And I hear a lot of blacks saying, oh, no, they won't, blah, blah. It's not mandated in the Constitution. Yeah, they will. And George Bush would have had he not been bogged down in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So this is a part of what post-Reconstruction means. But one of the biggest erosions comes with the Supreme Court decision of 2013, whereby a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court eviscerated the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the biggest gains of the Black freedom movement. And they did this by freeing 9 states, most of which were the former Confederate states, of oversight. Again, putting blacks and brown people back into the hands of the states. And so the states that were relieved from oversight of the old Confederacy were Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia, and then and Georgia, and then added to it Alaska and Arizona, and then also Louisiana Confederacy as well. And so that means that the states are free to do what they want to do with voting rights as it affects blacks. So what the 2013 Supreme Court decision that ended federal supervision of mostly former Confederate states did to voting laws was similar to what the Hayes-Tilden Compromise did, except the Hayes-Tilden Compromise completely wipes out the right of blacks to vote because it gives the South the command over blacks, and blacks are just generally stripped of their rights. The 2013 Supreme Court decision is putting blacks into a position where black voting rights are seriously weakened through restrictive ID laws. Some still don't get this point. Some blacks that these ID laws are no good. Some say, oh, well, what's wrong with ID? Well, it's the ID blacks don't have that they're demanding that they have. And poor blacks generally can't afford to go to a auto place, where, they give you these IDs. They're not able to do that, and they can't afford hardly to get on a bus, And so these restrictions are now aimed at particular practices that will hurt blacks without saying that it's blacks that they're attacking. This has enabled states to gerrymander. in ways in which they combine districts so that it dilutes Black voting rights. And of course, gerrymandering has now been used to guarantee a minority of Republicans control of the House. And in all likelihood, in this midterm, they're likely to seize the House back just based on gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is basically designed to preserve minority white control in a situation in which they will be a minority, not just of Republicans, but of whites. That's not sustainable forever. But right now, that's what's happening in a state like Texas, where the Mexican American vote is expanding. So what we're seeing is that these measures are repeats in many ways of what we saw with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, because one of the characteristics of the 1876 deal, the glue that made this work, is the same glue that the 2013 Supreme Court evisceration of the voting rights bill is designed to do. That is to restore home rule. And this was a term that the Southerners constantly pushed. They wanted home rule, which meant the power of the states over Blacks to do their will. And so what we see then is with the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act, home rule is put in its place. States are allowed to do their will as they choose. And so without legal enforcement coming from the federal government, then that's what's going to happen. So the gains in the 60s of voting rights came through mass movement, particularly Birmingham and Selma. But it had to be sealed by federal voting rights legislation. That was King's strategy, and it was correct. And it was the same thing with Reconstruction. Reconstruction could only occur through federal action. It wasn't going to come from the states. It certainly wasn't coming from Mississippi, you know. Well, they'll hang you freely, but they're not going to give you anything that's good for you free. You know what I mean? So this federal intervention was central, and a lot of people will then give Johnson credit for this because he passed the bill. No, Johnson did it because there was a movement that put pressure on him. He decided to stand with history, and he said, with this, the Democrats are going to lose the South. And he's right. The Republican Party became the white party. Things get flipped. You understand? The party of dispossession, which we'll come up to in a minute. So what we're seeing in this second post Reconstruction is a restoration of home rule. Chief Justice Roberts uses this flaky excuse that, well, we can't go on previous data on this. We have to now look at the fact that Blacks are mayors in some of the cities in which they had faced discrimination before. And he's in effect saying that there's no longer any need to supervise states that have no interest in preserving Black or brown rights, when in fact he knows there is. But because he's a conservative, he's identifying with white power, he wants to restore it. And with Trump's help, he is. In fact, the Supreme Court is more to the right of him than it was before. So what does January the 6th have to do with the second post-Reconstruction? What does this post-Reconstruction have to do with the so-called Stop the Steal movement, launched by Trump and embraced by a majority of members of the Republican Party? That's the point. The January 6th insurrection is a good historical example of the similarities and differences between the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876 and the post-Reconstruction period starting in 1968. The major corporate media has portrayed the January 6th insurrection as basically just to stop the steal. This was a a rally called by Trump of over 100,000 people, and they wanted to stop the count on the presidential election under the false narrative that the election had been stolen. And of course, the media's whole thing is to constantly tell you it wasn't stolen. It's kind of like saying 1 and 1 is 2. Yeah, of course it wasn't stolen. But try and tell that to people who Trump has got on his side. But the key problem with their narrative, while it's true that that was the rallying cry for January the 6th, 2021, it wasn't the real reason for it. You understand? It wasn't about steal. You know what I mean? Whether the masses of Trump followers believe it or not, that wasn't really what it was about. Blacks know what this means. Most blacks know that stop the steal means that by blacks voting, we're stealing the vote, because the vote should be restricted to whites. That's what it means. The states and cities cited by Trump, Newt Gingrich, and others as places where the steal took place are all the places where blacks have majority voting power. Places like Cleveland and Atlanta and numerous other places. So, in fact, the day before January 6th insurrection, black voting power in Georgia put 2 Democrats into the Senate, shifting the Senate back to the Democratic Party by 1 vote. The black vote didn't steal the Senate. The black vote won the Senate. You hear me? So stop the steal is a code word for stopping black and brown people from voting and winning. And that has been carried out systematically at state levels. Systematically. People who have been legally empowered to count the votes, who are sincerely dedicated to doing a fair count, have been removed. And they're putting in people who buy into Trump's notion that his presidency was stolen from him. And so a million little methods have been devised to cut the black vote, much the way the Hayes-Tilden Compromise did a lot of vote stealing. I went into this in previous shows. Check out those previous shows. So blacks have a habit of using the church as a basis for mobilizing black voters. So that's been attacked under new legislation. One of the ways in which they have cut into the black vote is by cutting the number of polling places, and this has already happened in the last election, so that they're very few in black communities. So you saw these long lines of black people lined up. And so what would black people do? Bring a chair, bring water, bring food. They say, I'm staying. There's black people. We'll adapt to this stuff, you know? So now the law says that it's illegal to bring water to somebody who's standing in or sitting in a line, you know what I mean? Or to provide any aid for anybody, you know what I mean? So all of these are aimed at black voting practices to reduce the black vote. And then for the longest, they've had a series of policies in effect of cleaning the rolls, where they will send out mail to people asking them to respond. And if they don't, they cut them off the polls, the voting polls, or they'll cut them off because they'll say that, well, this name isn't consistent with the person that normally lives there, when in fact it is. You know what I mean? They got all kinds of methods like this. This was used in the last election, but still Trump got whipped. So they're tightening it more to give the presidency back to them, but to give the Congress back to the Republican Party. So this is Second Post Reconstruction. And by the way, this is also aimed at younger white voters who have tended to vote either independent or Democratic. And so it's designed, a lot of these ID laws are particularly aimed at them to restrict the number of young people who vote, many of whom are white. Stacey Abrams, who has played a very important role in registering Black voters in Georgia, along with a number of other sisters and other Blacks, ran for governor a few years ago, and that election was stolen from her. She's running again. And this campaign of stacking the vote counting process in these states with people who will change the vote. And by the way, during post Reconstruction and during a part of Reconstruction, that the Democrats, the whites, would go in and simply stack the ballots, stuff them after an election went down. So that was another way of gaining some kind of political power. So Stacey Abrams is faced with that now. This is post Reconstruction. So some of the same measures used to deny the Black vote today was used yesterday. But remember the point I made in my show on how Black military power defeated the Confederacy during the Civil War. I made the point then, and I will expand on that point now. While the techniques for voter suppression and other attacks on Black civil and human rights are the same today as yesterday, the strategic reasons for these attacks are different. Also, the strategic power position of Blacks today is different from our position in 1876. Our strategic power position is much stronger. This is because while the spiral of history leads to similar historical cycles, because history zigs and zags, these historical cycles are never exactly the same. Some are very similar, but never exactly the same. And in this particular case, the cycle favors us, favors people of color. Trump increased his 2020 presidential vote mainly among whites by 10.1 million votes. While they stressed he got a few more Black votes and brown votes, not enough to make a difference. Overwhelming 86% of Black males voted against Trump. 92% of Black females voted against Trump. And a majority of Latinos, over a majority, voted against Trump, though few more voted for him than had before. Most of his increase in votes came from whites, a 10.1 million vote increase. But he couldn't win the presidency. Why? Because Trump's very strengths are his weakness. His strength is with white people and a few brainwashed people of color. That's his strength. That's his weakness. Wherever you find your strength, you'll also find your weakness. His weakness is that his appeal is almost exclusively to whites. When whites are declining voting percentage, declining, when their population is declining, this is the weakness. And then if he alienates any small part of that, that's an opening for the other side. And so a part of the suburban vote went against Trump. That gave Biden an inroad. But the main thing is Trump faced a coalition led by Black Lives Matter demonstrations, led by Blacks, and then brown, red and yellow people, and a third of the voters who were white in the Democratic vote. Whereas Blacks vote almost solidly one way, whites split. That's something we don't know, because we have this idea that we're alone and all the rest of this stuff. You ain't organized nothing. I mean, if you have, there's splits all over the place. Politics about alliances and coalitions. And so Trump was beaten by a bigger coalition. The weakness of the Democrats was that the person that they had, they weren't enthusiastic for. That's why he didn't carry any coattails into the House or the Senate. He was an anti-Trump vote. That was enough to win, but it wasn't enough to sweep the House of the Senate, which is what they should have done. So Trump was out-allied, out-organized, out-maneuvered. And I predicted in my show on Black Power that this would happen. But some have this idea that we're always losing. You don't chalk up a victory. You whipped Trump. In spite of all the stacking of everything, you whipped him. And so this tells you we're in a different cycle. Even though the cycle is the second post Reconstruction, it's not the same as the first one. And in this one, you wield greater power. Your culture is a stronger force now than then. Your culture radicalizes other forces. You're the driving force when you go into motion. The Black movement for social change leads all other movements in this country. Of course, it gets its opposition from the right and those whites that back it. But even then, we cut into the youth. We get a sizable number of their youth. Why? Because they have a sense of idealism. Some of them have not yet grown into adapting to the culture of their people totally. Some of them end up being supportive of our movements. But the key point is Trump was outflanked. And I predicted that this would happen. And anyone that really looked at this should have seen it coming. So while the first post-Reconstruction and the second post-Reconstruction are similar methods of repression, the strategic position of the United States and the world has shifted, and it's shifted in our favor. In the first post-Reconstruction, white, and I will use this term for then, I don't use it now, white supremacy was in control of the US. America was rising, and by the end of World War I, America had become the global creditor nation. Britain, the so-called foremost power that had ruled the waves for 300 years, now owed their debts to the United States. This was the decline of Britain. Its fall would be in World War II, where in exchange for American military equipment and stuff until Lend-Lease came along, the United States went to South Africa and emptied its banks of its gold that was owned by the British. To pay for this, Winston Churchill had to get on his knees and beg Roosevelt not to do that anymore, because as an old empirist, colonialist, and racist, he wanted to restore British rule in the world at the end of World War II. But what had happened is America had supplanted them. And so for 27 years, remember the British had 300, America ruled the world, 27. What kind of dummy that has this kind of power would lose it so quick? I don't have time to go into this one. You know what I mean? Another show, I'll go into this one. The decline of American power. You know what I mean? It took some real stupidity for this power to go down. Well, what makes them sad, as Malcolm said, makes me glad. You know what I mean? I'm glad to see this power go down. I know some of you say, yeah, but we're here. You know what I mean? Yeah, you're catching the bad end of it. I'm all for power that's just, not unjust. You know what I mean? So America's in a different strategic position internationally. It's in decline. And by 2040, 2047, we don't know the exact date, but in that time, China's going to displace America as the primary global power. You know, that's a fact. I'm just stating facts here, you know. And so when we look at January the 6th, that protest isn't just about stop the steal. It's about the fact that these whites, who ain't exactly experts on history, but some of them are pretty well read, because some of the leaders of the right got PhDs. Some of them are highly educated. Then others are field troops that don't know up from down. But the key point is some of them have seen the handwriting on the wall. the historical handwriting on the wall. And most of them that may not know much about history knows their numbers are going down the tube. They ain't reproducing enough to keep up with us, to keep up with the Latinos, to keep up with the Asians. And red people, they're growing. The 10% that survived the genocide, they're growing in numbers and culture and in consciousness. And so by the same time period in which America will decline as a global power and fall as a global power economically, at that same time, the numerical power of whites will have gone through the bottom. And whites will be a minority in this country, as they are right now in this state, California, the biggest state in the United States. So the majority of whites, including those at the Stop the Steal rally, and Donald Trump, their drum major, they have a psychology of what I've characterized before and a number of scholars on the right wing have called the mentality of dispossession. This is their mentality. The majority of whites, not all whites, feel dispossessed because Black folks have dispossessed them of power over us, political power. We dispossess them of political power over us through defeating them on voting rights and legal apartheid. And while they're trying to bring it back through Supreme Court decisions, they cannot put that baby completely to sleep like they did in 1876. The right wing, the old right wing, the Ku Klux Klan, and the new right wing, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, all of them included, have a deep sense of dispossession. In Trump's case, this is funny. Before he ran for president, he hired a Black man who was hired to dress up like Obama and sit in his office. And he'd pay him so that he could tell him he's fired. Now, this is somebody who's psychologically dispossessed. He was so enraged, as were a large number of whites, by the occupancy of the presidency by a Black man, that he had to go through these theatrics. Now, how sick can you get? You know what I mean? That's carrying Celebrity Apprentice to a new level. Now, the majority of whites don't see their lower standard of living as being caused by corporate greed. Some do, but a lot don't. They don't see it, their lower standard of living, as being caused by deindustrialization. Some do, most don't. They don't attribute their starvation wages that they face now, along with Blacks and people of color, due to a McDonald's economy where they're not paying most service workers a living wage. Now, there's the high-end economy, there's the high-tech economy, dominated heavily by whites and some Asians. And Blacks need to get into that technology sector and build their own high-tech businesses. The majority of whites feel dispossessed because they believe that the government is favoring Blacks and people of color over them, even though the government isn't. This was the same attitude that the French had at the turn of the century, where they viewed the French government as favoring Jews over the masses of French. And according to Hannah Arendt, in her book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, she said, these were the seeds of genocide. And so it's something that you shouldn't just take for granted. This is serious. This is the perception. So while the January 6th insurrection was billed as a stop the steal of Donald Trump's presidency, it was actually a Custer's last stand. It was a stand against white America's loss of white dominance over the United States. Custer was, in the movement, we'd always say, I don't want to be Custered, meaning defeated. that was a military defeat at the hands of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull was a great spirit leader of the Lakota people. He actually dreamed the strategy for Little Bighorn. And Custer, who wasn't the greatest general alive, not the greatest strategist, fell into it and got wiped out. And so this, for many whites, is a Little Bighorn moment. It's kind of like a last stand for whites to try and reign supreme in the world. And so they've got these little maneuvers that I've just described, but these maneuvers are going against a high tide of history that is sweeping against them as they are going into decline. And I know a lot of you will say, oh yeah, they're minority status, doesn't mean anything. They control the corporations, they control the military, they control the politics. I pointed this out before. The power of whites in this country started with numerical power. It was a fact that whites kept coming into this country, combined with gunpowder and then steam power, the railroads and all this technology. But the main power was numerical power. And that numerical power gave them the power to carry out genocide in this country, along with the mentality of racism that put red people in the category of subhuman and proceeded to wipe them out. Whites getting paid for every head they could chop off or scalp. And by the way, scalping didn't start with Native Americans, started with the Scots-Irish in Ulster, when they were given Ulster by the British. And by the way, the Irish were the first colonial project carried out by the British. And so the Scots, who were called Scots-Irish, but they were Scots, they went in and, scalped the Irish or cut their heads off. You understand? This is the Queen system, the King system. And so Native Americans only returned the favor. That's not something they started. But the key point is you're now seeing a phase of post-Reconstruction in the second one that's different from the first. The tide of history is rising in our favor. The rise of Asia. In the future, it will be the rise of Africa. The empowerment of Africans in this country to free themselves of the restrictions that we've faced so far have come from us, our power, along with the support of others. Black power has been increased by the fact that we're strategically located in this country. So as we move, other groups move and respond to it, whether it's Latinos, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, or young whites. And so what we see at this time, despite the steals of post-Reconstruction, 1876 and 1968, Blacks have prevailed. We defeated the Confederacy through arms. The Southern movement through jiu-jitsu, martial arts moves, wrestled it down. Despite every post-Reconstruction measure, we put a Black person in the presidency. And in spite of all of the steal measures, we defeated Trump. In spite of every measure to intimidate us, as Malcolm said, this younger generation lost its fear. Well, it had lost its fear a long time ago. As Malcolm would say, said the younger generation doesn't care about the odds. That's what produced the Black Panther Party, a self-defense movement, Black Power, the Black Freedom Movement. You hear me? Spirit of resistance against enormous odds. When you come out of a culture like ours that's marked by creativity, roadblocks aren't that hard to overcome. Today, if you send white sheets into Black communities, that's dangerous for the white sheets. Blacks ain't afraid of no boogeyman. You hear me? In fact, what we need to do is curtail the violence in our own community against each other. That is a greater threat than the Ku Klux Klan. We need to stop that. So finally, and in conclusion, the future belongs to those who prepare. You got to plan. You got to organize to prepare for this power shift that's underway in the US and globally. Learn from history and learn the most important lesson. The future belongs to those who prepare. And when history's at a high tide, who build ships that can sail on that high tide and learn how to swim. You hear me? This is the high tide where unjust power systems must be replaced by just ones. And so all this transformation that I talk about when I'm talking about sixfold stages to mental freedom, the mighty insights of a El Hajj Malik El Shabazz or Ella Baker or Fannie Lou Hamer, or now a lot of these young Black Lives Matter activists, or Sister Assata Shakur, and many others, comes from an inner transformation. And so the society that we need to build outside of us, we have to start by rebuilding ourselves, reconstructing ourselves. I don't care how conscious we are, raising it higher, while at the same time being engaged in something greater than ourselves to improve the conditions of our people. Because we're all here with special gifts. Whatever your gifts are, use them for your own benefit, but to uplift your people and to uplift humanity. And it's when you pipe into this higher power that your power arises. I don't care what anyone else does to cheat you out of your rights or anything else. When you're conscious, that ain't gonna work. You hear me? Thievery ain't gonna carry you too far. You hear me? So I hope you got something out of this. You know what time it is. This is the second post Reconstruction. By the way, the post Reconstructions are the periods where Blacks develop the highest level of consciousness when it comes to what's called nationalism, love of self and love of people, seeing yourself as a nation. Usually when the pressure's highest, that's where our consciousness rises even higher. So as bad as some of this sounds, it's the basis for the good that comes. You understand? Remember, history has its ups and downs. History is twin. It's both positive and negative. So whatever somebody does to bring you down, that is really the measure for you rising up. And it's when you raise your consciousness that you're able to transcend your condition and to come up with strategies, tactics, philosophies, programs that will empower you. Hotep. Sister Sandra Bell. Hey. Righteous and powerful, thank you. See if we have any comments here. Sun Temple, we Black people living abroad and in America need to organize ourselves and relocate back to the continent of Africa. Marcus Garvey had the right idea. Yeah, those that choose to should, but I'm going to tell you most won't. So we need to have a program for those that go and for a program for those that stay. I was at one point one that thought we were all going to, or most of us were going to go, but I discovered that ain't happening. And in fact, we've got who knows how many millions of Blacks, 40, 50 million in this country. We have to Africanize this reality and straighten it out. And those that want to go back, do that. But we need to take the best from this culture to make something crooked straight. And that's part of our challenge too. And by the way, Garvey didn't generally call for all of us going back. By the way, Garvey was one of my first masters. Great man, great organizer. Let's see what else we have here. Brother Ogawa, happy winter solstice, Black Power, squared family. See if there's anything else. Lao Zoo, happy New Year. See if there's any questions up here. Okay, Brother Ogawa, can you speak more on the Supreme Court's role in turning back the civil rights gains? Yeah, well, affirmative action was one move. The Post Reconstruction decision with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, that was a move by putting two Southern justices on the Supreme Court that guaranteed that the civil rights bill that had been passed towards the end of the Grant administration would be overruled. And as it was, that bill didn't have much teeth in it. So there have been a lot of moves that the Supreme Court has made against Black rights. But this move to eviscerate the 1965 Voting Rights Bill is, of all of them, the most serious. And it's one that the Supreme Court had been waiting to do for a long time. See if there's anything else there. See if there's anything on the bottom. Lao Tzu. How do we create or work towards a new world with the threat of climate change reaching a tipping point within the next 20 to 50 years? Good question. I did a show on the spiritual blues, the philosophy, basically for saving the planet. And I was showing how to save the planet, it's going to take more than quick fixes, and we need the quick fixes. The ending of the use of fossil fuels, for example, that heat up the climate, poison the atmosphere. But we also need a philosophy that puts us in harmony with nature. And so, as a part of restructuring this society, a conclusion that both King and Malcolm concluded needed to be done, it was certainly a lesson I've learned that some of us have learned. A part of that is that you're going to have to restructure the society to also make this happen. Though it can't happen without its restructure. It's needed. And so that's also a part of transformation. It's transforming our relationship to nature as well as our relationship to each other. And part of it comes from the best features of our past, updating it. Part of it comes from new transformational systems we need to create. So when I talk about twin lineal families, that's a foundation of society, families. One reason why a lot of revolutions have failed is that they've held on to the same old system where men oppress women. So you're talking about redistributing the wealth in the economy, but at the same time, you're beating your wife or mistreating her or your children or elders at home, you know? So one is inseparable from the other. So reconstructing a society also means taking the best of our culture to reconstruct family systems. They're at the foundation of nations. The same thing with economies. And all of this, for example, the African communal idea, sharing not owning the land, air, and water, was the idea of leaving it in better condition than you received it. I discussed that on the show where I dealt with African philosophy and communal economics. So in shifting the economy, the environment is built in, because in African societies, we didn't separate the material from the spiritual. What's interesting about the Marxists, and I'm not anti-Marxist, I'm going to stress this, I am not. But it's interesting that as the Russians moved to industrialize, something they needed to do on a certain level, it saved them from the Germans in World War II for sure. They were poisoning the atmosphere at a rapid rate, not as rapid as the US because the US economy is bigger. But they were doing it. They didn't have a philosophy that would tie the environment into the economy. So part of this shift has got to do with your philosophical shift. Part of it's got to do with drawing from the best of your history. But the main thing is conceiving of it. Conceiving that you can actually transform the society that you're in, as opposed to accepting it or thinking there's nothing you can do. So that was, as usual, Lao Tzu asked a good question. But he's making a point that if we go beyond the tipping point, it's going to be hard to have a just society if the atmosphere is poison. And it is poison now, but beyond the tipping point, then it's going to be terrible. And you're seeing how these storms and, you know, how all the extremes of weather are playing out now. Everything that's the worst is happening because it's indicating that you're close to that tipping point. Nature is like a woman. There's a delicate side to her, a strong side to her. But to really be able to work with nature, you've got to be delicate, because nature is the most powerful force in our lives. And it's got to be treated with respect. And we're just the microcosm of it. So it's a whole philosophy that's got to shift on that. That's what's really important. You know, we can't have just societies and an unjust relationship to nature. You know? Okay, I think that's it. I don't see any others. So I hope you got something out of this. I enjoy doing this. And subscribe to the show. Encourage others to do it as well. I'm enjoying this. Share your thoughts with me. Brother Doozy Magwaza, thank you for your compliment. I appreciate everybody that appreciates this. I'm doing this mainly to do exchange, to share whatever I have and to learn from you. So, Hotep, I appreciate this. Love all of you.